is already in that trip. And
all right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our August Lunch and Learn, focused on active shooter, active killer planning. So last month we had, a little bit more of a background, higher level view of what this is all about. And we heard you, we listened to you. There was obviously not enough time, if you were here last time, to get through a lot of questions. We knew from the evaluations that there needed to be a follow-up to that last month's session. So a lot of familiar faces here, so thanks for coming back. We do have an hour, and hopefully we'll have time for questions this time, but Dutch has such knowledge of this subject. It's hard to stop and ask questions, so we appreciate everything that you do here. Vending in here if you need something to drink, coffee over there, restrooms down the hall to the left. Time for a shameless plug, if I could. Next month, we're going to be talking about reunification. So after a situation like this, how do you get family together again, kids and their family and parents together? So Heartland AEA will be our panel for next month. So that would be a good one to also tune into if you can. And as always, our presentations are recorded. And if you can't make a presentation, you can always go to our website, see what ones that we have produced in the past, and review those at your leisure. So today's will also be recorded and are typically available within the next few days after our presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dutch Geisinger, our Deputy Director for EMA.
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming. How many people made it to last month's presentation? Great. One of the things that we got out of the evaluations is that they liked the material, they liked the background education piece of it, but they really wanted more of a focus on planning. So I got together with Deanne and we created basically a presentation that would cover some of those planning components that you don't always get when we talk about active threat. Usually the focus is on response. We talk a lot about run, hide, fight, and the Department of Homeland Security's response methods that they've put together for our business and other government partners. But we really don't talk about how to develop those plans. And it's funny because when anybody calls us and they say we want to do an active shooter exercise, the very first question we ask is, what does your plan say? So we really got to put that planning effort first, find out what the plans say, make sure that we're doing the right type of planning so that when we want to practice those things and do those exercises and training with our organizations, we have the plans in place and that they're solid. So that was one of the big takeaways from last month's training that we did. So really, we're going to put together a couple things here. We're going to talk about some historical information. How do we determine where to focus our planning efforts? And when I say that, I'm going to say this over and over again. I don't want you just to go back and think, well, I need to develop just an active shooter plan. I really want you to go back and focus on developing that culture of preparedness and developing an emergency action plan or emergency operations plan. So the bigger picture is, we'll talk about that a lot here in the next couple slides, but we've got to develop an emergency operations plan that focuses on all of those potential threats that are out there. Active threat is one of those things, obviously. We want to talk about the basic planning method and some considerations for a specific active threat event. And then again, we ought to practice those things. We can't just build a plan and then set it on a shelf because that's ineffective. We used to build great plans, and I think they went by weight. The bigger the 3-ring binders were, the better you were. But what we found out is those got set on a shelf, they collected a lot of dust, and then 3 years later, we dust them off and change the names probably, and then never use them. We want to make sure that the plans are effective, that there's something that you can use. We use the training and exercise to develop better plans. We identify those gaps and we plug those things back in that we need to. And then lastly, we need to review the plans. Make sure that we've got a plan in place to take them out at least annually, do spot checks on them, make sure that the things are valid. So let's help if we don't go backwards. I do want to give you some historical information. I don't want to be a fear monger. You hear a lot of people that get up in front of groups and they talk about active threat and they say, man, it's not if, but when we're going to have an active threat event. And active threats are on the rise. And if you look at the FBI information that's in front of you now, in 2021, there were 61 active threat events in the United States, right? Previous years had been hovering around 30 for a long time. So yeah, they are on the rise, but this is 61 events in all of those organizations, institutions, businesses, government facilities around the entire United States. So Can it happen? Absolutely. It can happen anywhere. It can happen anytime. These are very dynamic events. They change, they evolve quickly. But likelihood, it's a very rare event. Impact is so high though with this that we still have to plan for it. I got to quit hitting that button. A little bit of background on where those things take place, because we hear about them in schools all the time, right? Really, commerce. That's the biggest place that things take place. Those retail venues, either indoor or outdoor retail venues. So 32 out of those 61 took place in commerce. The next highest one was in open spaces, right? They do happen again, like I said, in educational institutions, but the number is really small. This percentage across the board is very consistent over the last several years. If you broke it down into percentage, this would be pretty consistent. But there again, we can't just plan for an active threat event. So we can't just plan for active threat. We have to look at all of those things that are out there. So this is a quote from me just now. Feel free to use that, publish it. I'd like to get some notoriety for that. But we got to take the time to develop an actual emergency action plan. I'm kind of changing the wording a little bit. I've used emergency action plan so often and EAP so often that when I started talking about human resources and I talk about EAP, it means a whole different thing. So employee assistance programs, which is part of this conversation as well, is a different type of EAP. So think about emergency operations and the planning that goes into that. Some of the things that you can do. We talk about emergency operation plans. Really, there's a CPG 101, Comprehensive Planning Guide 101 from FEMA is a really good guide. If you've never developed an emergency operations plan, this will walk you through step by step. One of the great things about this guide itself is that it tells you that you have to do this for your own organization. You can structure it so it makes sense for your own organization. There's not a specific template that you can use because you really have to tailor it to make it fit what you do. The different sections that are available, you want to make sure the flow is right. It depends on how you're going to use the guide. But again, make sure that that progression is the way that you want to see it. So each element has to follow the next and it has to flow correctly. I just worked with an organization yesterday on their emergency operations plan. Their concept is that they're going to have a concept of operations, which is a public-facing document that explains the overall purpose of the plan. It flows from there into more of the roles and responsibilities. What are the expectations of your employees? From there, it goes into kind of a checklist where it flows into what are the actual specific things that happen during whatever type of event comes up. So whether it's a fire, a tornado, or an active threat, right? If you follow that guide and you stay consistent, there's certain things that you're going to see that come out of it. We talk about a risk management approach to any planning that we do when it comes to disasters. So we're going to hit that up in just a minute. The main thing you have to remember is that active shooter is one component of your emergency operations plan. Going back and developing an emergency or an active shooter plan doesn't necessarily make your organization prepared. So think about that main plan as the parent, and then those different annexes underneath that should be how it flows. So you'll see something for fire, you'll see something for bad weather, severe weather, man-made events, hazmat events, all of those things. There is a publication that's out there that I'll talk about in just a second. So CISA, everybody familiar with CISA? Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. They have some great resources for you. If you visit their website, they actually have an active shooter plan template that you can follow. And when I say template, it's basically a guide that walks you through the different steps that you have to take. You still have to put the plan together so it fits your organization. But again, there's a lot of resources that are available out there for you. A shameless plug for us, give us a call. Emergency management has a lot of resources available too. Personnel, people that have been involved in this. My background is I started in the military. I was a military person for 12 years. I went into law enforcement, was a local law enforcement officer in Cedar Falls, Iowa for 12 years, and really started getting involved in business continuity, emergency operations planning back then. I got recruited by the state to come in and be the Homeland Security Program Manager for a while, and then went to the federal government, worked with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security in the CISA organization before it was actually CISA. And we started developing programs like Run, Hide, Fight back then. We started developing the programs of plan development, organizations, exercise programs, training programs. So a lot of the material that you're going to see in the next few slides come from that background in education. Everything we do focuses on a risk management approach. Who's familiar with risk management? Who considers themselves a risk expert? I see one hand.
Military says I am.
Military says you're, I know Tom very well. Tom and I have been friends for a long, long time. So who drove here today? Most of you. Who rode here today? Okay, everybody got here somehow, right? So before you left, what kind of things did you look at? If this was January, would that make a difference in whether you decided to come or not? The weather, icy roads, snowstorms. If there was a snowstorm coming on, would you all still come to see me?
Absolutely.
Thanks, Chad. I really appreciate it. You do, you take into account what threats are out there, right? You take into account those outside things that might impact your ability to get here safely. And then you look at the vulnerabilities. What kind of shape is my car in? What kind of shape are my tires in? Can I actually get there okay? And then you look at the consequences. What are those things that might be the outcome if I'm driving an unsafe car in really bad conditions? This is stuff that we do every day. So I challenge you that you're all risk managers to some degree, because you make those decisions based on those three factors all the time. When we talk about risk, we talk about those three things. We talk about threat. We have to look at all the threats that are out there, how they pertain to us. We look at the vulnerabilities. Based on those threats, what are the vulnerabilities to my agency, my organization, my critical components, my critical nodes, all of those things that go into it. And then what are the consequences, are the outcomes? If we look at those threats and those vulnerabilities that we have, what are the consequences if we don't address those things? We can't eliminate all risk, but we can bring it down into a point where it's manageable. There's a big difference between risk and acceptable risk, because there's certain things we can do to mitigate risk. Even if we can't change the way that we operate, we can't buy the equipment, we might be able to insure ourselves, right? To get that risk down to an acceptable level. So I kind of want to break these things down into three different areas. And we talked about the threat already. We have to look at all those things that might impact us. If you had to look at threats that are around there, what kind of resources could you draw from? Who knows threats in your area?
Law enforcement.
Law enforcement, that's a great resource. Who else?
Noah?
NOAA? A lot of weather, historical information, things like that. Another shameless plug for emergency management. One of the things that we have that we are required to do if we want to be eligible for federal grants is a local hazard mitigation plan. Every county in Iowa, I believe it's every county now, has a local hazard mitigation plan. Part of that planning process is identifying the risk factors or the threat factors that are in your communities. They might not pertain specifically to your facility, but they pertain to the county. If you live on a really tall hill, a flood may not be a concern to you, but it might be a concern elsewhere in the county. But it's a great resource to get started. If we look at those threats that are out there, all of those different types of events that might impact us, that might threaten our organization and our way of doing operations, those goals and objectives and our mission, we can list all of those things. This is one tool that's available, but there's a number of tools that are out there. Kaiser Permanente is another tool that's used by hospitals and medical organizations. A lot of these are free resources. Grab those things and take a look at them, because we don't want to try to address all threats. Is it practical to address every single threat that might be out there? Absolutely not. Can we protect every single one of our assets? Nope. So we have to break it down somehow. So one of the things that we can do when we start looking at threats is we can prioritize those things that are most important. This is one tool that's available, right? So you list the events, you look at probability. We look at those things. Are they likely to happen? Are they unlikely to happen? We already talked about active shooter possibly being lower on that list. It might not be as big of a probability. The impact of an active shooter event, when we're talking specifically about that, is so high though, that we have to pay attention to it. Because we look at the human impact, the consequences. We look at possibility of death or injury, very, very high. We look at damage to property from past events, and we've got to learn from those past events. We know that that could be very high. We know that it's going to cause business interruption. In fact, in many of the cases, those buildings, does anybody know what happened to Sandy Hook School after the shooting there? Yeah, they tore it down, right? Millions and millions of dollars are spent on remodeling just because they want employees to feel safe to come back to work again. So we know business interruption is going to be a high impact. Level of preparedness, right? We might be able to buy down some of that risk by being more and more prepared. We used to not be prepared for fire events. Does anybody know the last time that we had a large number of kids killed in a school fire in the United States?
In Our Lady of Angels in Chicago.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Our Lady of Angels in Chicago. Do you remember what year that was?
61, late 50s, early 60s.
58. Very, very close. 58. Right? There are over 90 kids and teachers killed in that fire. But what do we do now to protect ourselves from fire events?
Fire drills.
What was that?
Fire drills.
Fire drills. Absolutely. What else?
Prevention and inspection.
Prevention inspections.
Sprinkler systems.
Equipment. We put sprinklers in, right? We do all of these things to protect ourselves from fire. Where are we at with active shooter?
Infancy.
Pretty darn new, right? Relatively in the scheme of things, active threat is something that we're just starting to address. We're starting to do those drills. We really haven't gotten proficient at them like we have with fire drills. There is equipment that's out there. We're starting to test those things. Really experiment with what's good and what's bad. We'd love to see it at a point where I can talk about active threat events and say, 50 years ago, we had our last big active threat event because we've put all these things in place. We're not quite there yet. So after you look at your threats, you really got to look at the vulnerabilities that exist because of those threats. So we look at our essential functions. What are those things that are necessary to keep our businesses up and running? Our essential missions, our objectives, and our goals. So think about those things that you have, those networks, cyber systems, people that are really important for our organizations. I see a lot of folks from Drake here, and I know the focus for you is on your students, making sure that your students feel safe to come to class, right? There's a lot of other things that go into it, but that's one of your critical nodes. So we got to look at all of those things, look at the threats that are out there, and then that's how we focus our areas. That's how we focus on our planning activities. The last thing that we can do, if we have to sell this, we don't always have administrations that are willing to just accept what we're telling them as that what needs to be the focus areas. But if we can put some consequence to it, if we can put some context to those things that we identify as potential threats, it really helps put things in perspective. So making those context statements, it may sound like it's one of those things like, man, I don't want to run through that exercise, but we talk about tornadoes all the time. Do we have tornadoes in the Midwest? Yep. So what does that mean for you? If you had to go to your boss and say, I need to make a tornado plan, why would you say that? Your boss says, why? Why do we need a tornado plan?
Because it's the highest probability of a bad event where we live.
High probability of a bad event. If you just said to your boss, well, tornadoes happen in the Midwest and those are bad, is that enough? No. Same thing with an active shooter. Active shooter events happen across the United States and those are bad. Is that enough of a selling point to make your boss want to spend resources on it? If you're lucky, maybe. But if we can add some context to it, and this is why I always say to add these context statements. The second statement here, at approximately 2 p.m. on Wednesday, September 15th, a tornado was spotted west of Any City, Iowa. As the tornado reached the high school, it reached an EF4 magnitude. When it hit the school, it caused extensive damage, including significant impacts to shelter areas within the main building. The tornado continued eastward, destroying 2 communication towers and the city's main fire station. Is that a more impactful statement? Now we've added some context. Now we've got people that are actually injured or killed. Our communication system's down and we can't respond to it. Those context statements are really important for you to put things in the right frame of mind when you're developing your plans. If you're starting to develop your context statements and it comes up that I can't think of anything bad that happens as a result of this, it might be time to move on to the next threat. Pre-planning, training, and exercises are the single best thing that we can do to buy down that risk. How many of you have emergency operations plans now? How many of those include components for active threat? Do you feel that those are complete? Is there room for improvement? Yeah, if you think your plan's 100% complete, thanks for coming today. I appreciate it, but there's always room for improvement. We've always got to test. We've got to find those gaps. And we've got to improve the plans. It's really important that when we talk about emergency operations plans, and specifically about active shooter plans, that we tailor the plan to our facilities or our organizations. Every organization is different. If you try to pick up somebody else's active threat plan and just adopt that, change the name at the top, it's probably not going to be effective for you, because every building's layout is different. Until you understand what that threat looks like, a lot of businesses have gone to open floor plans. Nothing on the desktops, right? Flat tables. Does that change your perspective when you're developing that active threat plan? Absolutely it does. How many of your plans focus on run, hide, fight as a response? Most of the plans across the entire United States, most of the training that you'll see across the entire United States really is founded in run, hide, fight. It doesn't matter whether it's Alice training or Craze training or any of those other things that are out there. Really, run, hide, fight is the foundation. It's important to understand when you're talking to your employees, you're doing that training, what the options are for them. We've got to be able to empower them to make those decisions based on their own physical capabilities, knowledge, health, whatever it might be, so they can do the right thing with limited information. When you're developing your plans, really that helps put that in perspective. If you know the layout of your building, if you know those areas you can go to that you can lock down, make sure that no one else can get in, that have a back way out of the building, those types of things, that's great information to share with your employees, right? It helps them make those decisions. We walk through the plan development. Sometimes that component is better than the plan itself. The ability to bring the people in that need to make those decisions. AJ refers to it as the sausage making. We always want to get to the end because that sausage is really good, but the sausage making can get really dirty and nasty, and there's a lot of things that go into it, right? But without the sausage making, we don't learn all of those things that we need to have to make that really good sausage at the end. We want to have that really good plan, but we've got to make all those efforts, bring all those people in, and sometimes we learn so much from that process. It's just as important as the final plan. So we talk about specifics with an active threat plan. And really this is true of any plan, but the active threat plan specifically, we really have to have a good planning team. Can you develop a really good plan in a bubble? If you just went back to your office and locked yourself in, could you do it? You could probably come up with a plan. You could probably pull a lot of things off the internet, the Google. AJ likes it when I call it the Google. You can pull in a lot of components that you need to have, but you don't have all the information, right? It's really important to build a good team to develop your plans. Members of management, people that are the decision makers. Human resources, because part of the planning process is that you're going to tell people what their roles and responsibilities are, right? Your staff, your members of your team. Is it important for human resources to be able to say, hey, look, you can't ask them to do that? Or no, that's perfectly fine. You can't ask them to do those things. Human resources is great to have in the room. They also can identify that EAP that I talked about earlier, the Employee Assistance Program, and what's available. Because part of it should be that we focus on prevention as well. We'll get to that in just a second, though. Security and protection, engineering, IT, that facilities manager, great people to have in the room. Any attorneys in the room? Oh, good, I can make fun of them then. Corporate legal staff, legal interpretation of the plan. Again, really good to have somebody that can tell you the legal aspects, liability issues that you might be developing when you're developing those plans. Think about how you could bring somebody in that could give you some advice, tips, look at the legal sections of that. And obviously we want to think about how we can incorporate local law enforcement. There's two reasons for law enforcement. It's really important that we know how law enforcement's going to respond. How many folks from law enforcement are in the room? I see several people that I recognize from our active threat work group that we have in Polk County. That active threat work group is really important here because we talk to each other. We talk about the training education that we're going to offer to our partners in the community. It's really important that we're consistent in the message that we're given. So we're really lucky here that we've got a team like that that works together. Not everybody has that. So think about incorporating law enforcement into your team. Not only so you can understand better how they're going to respond, but they can understand how you're going to respond. So they know what to look for when they get to your facility. The right size, this is actually something that I stole from DHS, but normally not less than 4 people to help make those plans and decisions, but not more than 10. Why is that important? Because you actually want to get something done, right? Has anybody ever been in that room with 20 people where we can't make a decision on what to have for lunch? So we want to make sure that we got the right size. We want to have the right team together in the right group. We don't want it to get too big. There's a lot of things you can take advantage of that you have in your existing plans, because a lot of the efforts that you've put forward already into those other things that you have, evacuation plans for fires, shelter in place for other issues, you can take a lot of those components and build those into your active threat plan. So take a look at what exists. Do you have an evacuation plan or a shelter in place plan? Can you use those as part of your active threat plan? Absolutely. It may not be verbatim, but there are components of that that you can use. A communications plan. That's something that we actually have pulled out as a separate plan in several instances on agencies that I've worked with, where they develop a communications plan. We have not rehearsed this, but AJ, in the number of exercises that you've done, what's the one thing that normally fails?
Communications.
Communications. I know I prompted that a little bit, but communications is always the issue. How do you communicate internally with your people? How do you communicate with those outside organizations? Either to let them know that you've got an issue going on campus, in your organization, in your business, and you don't want them to come there. You've got to be able to notify them right away, right? So do you have an alert notification system that you use? How do you coordinate that? Who sends those messages out? And finally, think about that plan review, the exercise and training programs that you have, and making sure that you incorporate that into your planning process. Specific to active shooter, there's a couple things that I wanted to mention to you. When you're doing your planning, it's really important that you look at prevention as well as response. We're going to talk about a couple things with prevention. And if you were here for last month, you heard me talk a lot about prevention. Run, hide, fight, like I said before, it's kind of the foundation for all the response activities, making sure that you're training your people what to do if an event like this should happen. One thing that we train when we talk about evacuation, we always train, hey, we'll go to this one point on the facility, right? We're all going to get together there. We're going to count heads, make sure that we've got everybody. An active shooter event, that doesn't necessarily pertain. We have historical events that we can learn from where people have planted things outside of buildings. So we don't necessarily want to go to those rally points. What they're telling people is, if you can get out and get away. We'll worry about accountability after the fact. But we've got to think about accountability, right? It's really important to make sure that your employees have that toolkit. So the training education that goes along with it. I'm going to say that over and over again. Training and exercise is really important to success of your plans. We talk about prevention. It's really important that we understand how we get to that point where people think that violence is their only option. So the pathway to violence is, has anybody ever heard of the 7 Signs of Terrorism? Used to be a program from the Department of Homeland Security, became the 8 Signs of Terrorism. It's kind of been modified for active shooter events to talk a little bit about the pathway, because there's always something that leads up to it. And all the events that we've looked at, and literally over 400 events that have been looked at by Department of Homeland Security, there's always a pathway. Normally it's a thought about violence. They've got a grievance of some sort and there's a thought about violence. Now, I think everybody thinks about that sometimes of, man, I've got an issue with that guy. I'd like to punch him in the nose. Is it just me? A lot of people just staring at me like, oh, I thought everybody thought that. Does that mean I'm going to end up being an active shooter at some point in my life? No. A lot of people think about those things, but when it gets to those next steps and we start thinking about plans to actually pull off or follow through with that, now we've got to start being concerned. One of the areas where we start acquiring things to actually pull this off. In a lot of active shooter events, you'll see that there was a purchase of a weapon leading up to the event. That is one of the best places where we can prevent an activity. If we can catch it where we've had a talk of violent activity, we're starting to think about plans, and a lot of times we hear about, man, I saw that on the internet, I saw it on Facebook, I saw it on social media that this person was planning those things. And now we go out and we actually buy a gun. A lot of times that's where we can intercept things. We've got a plan in place, we've got thoughts of violence, and now we've got a purchase of a weapon. Those are 3 big areas where we can actually work toward prevention. If we can spot those things. In our plans, we have to think about how do we let people know if you recognize these activities in another person, in a coworker or a student, things like that, there's got to be a pathway to let somebody know what you're seeing, right? So as you're developing your plans, think about how you can let people know. We've got an employee assistance program. You can go to somebody, you can talk to them about what you're seeing, and you can do it anonymously. Those are big factors. I don't want to go to AJ and say, man, I saw Cameron the other day and he was talking about having a gun and he's been talking about violent things. And then AJ goes to Cameron and said, hey, Dutch said you were buying guns and you're violent. Probably not the best thing to have happen. So understand what your employee assistance program says. Is there a way that you can report incidents? Is there a way you can do it anonymously and get somebody the help that they need, right? Because ultimately that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people that have a mental health issue and they need help, right? So we're trying to get them the help that they need. We're not telling on somebody. We're offering them a pathway to get some assistance. We work through the pathway. Again, we follow through with, after they acquire the means, they identify when the opportunities are. They look for those dates that are out there of a big event that's happening at the venue that they're looking at. They do probing and breaching tests. They try to cross the lines and see if I can get in okay, right? And then ultimately they comes to the area where they actually pull it off. There's a lot of things we can do for prevention. So if we can recognize that pathway and we see that ahead of time, there's a lot of places to intervene. Talk to law enforcement, talk to your supervisors, talk to the folks in your human resources departments, right? How many of you know what your employee assistance program says? That's not unusual. How many of you know what your car insurance policy says? See, that's not unusual either. When do you find out what your car insurance policy says?
After the fact.
Yeah, right after the accident, right? We don't want that to be the case. Find out now what your employee assistance program says. Learn what you can do to get somebody some help. We talked about vulnerability reduction. There's certain things that you can look at in your facilities. And when you're doing your planning, again, we talked about the threat already. We talked about identifying those vulnerabilities. Now we got to find a way that we can buy those things down. So how do we do that? We can acquire things. We can limit access to our facilities to a single point of access, right? Camera systems, they can be a prevention tool. They work really well for law enforcement as a tool to find out who did the bad thing, right? Placement of cameras. I hear a lot of folks talk about things like, I've got some old cameras that don't work anymore. I want to put them up as a prevention tool. Good idea? I can tell you about a number of lawsuits that have happened across the country because they had cameras up that didn't work. And people thought they had a false sense of security. Like there was a camera there where they're going to be able to catch the bad guy. Oh, well, that's not actually hooked up to anything. It's just there for looks. If you've got a piece of equipment that you're putting in place, make sure that it works, right? For your own good. Now think about the barriers. Think about panic buttons. Do you have a way to lock down your facility remotely? Or does somebody have to go out and actually use a key to lock the doors? Right? That might be the case, but again, make that one of the planning considerations. Physical layouts of parking areas, visibility of incoming threats. Do you have a window that you can look out and actually see somebody walking up that might have a weapon? All of those things, again, you might not have every one of those, but they're all planning considerations. There's a lot of, I mentioned the tools that are out there. CISA, the CISA organization that has some tools that are available. Homeland Security Protective Advisor. In Iowa, we have a gentleman named Chris Judge, that's the Protective Security Advisor. A lot of times he can come to your organization, do a walkthrough for you. There's no cost for it. He can tell you some of those things that he sees as potential vulnerabilities. Take advantage of that. A lot of our law enforcement agencies have community outreach, right? A lot of our law enforcement agencies have been trained in a program called CPTED. CPTED is crime prevention through environmental design. They look at your facilities, they look at those things that you have in place, give you some suggestions in how to make small, subtle differences in your design that make huge differences in your security posture. Again, most of those are free, so take advantage of them. It's really important that we look at our entire facility. Like I said before, the focus is hard. A lot of organizations that I work with have a single floor in a multi-story building. How do you break that down? It's really important to work with your partners, the other tenants in the building. Develop a plan that makes sense, that's consistent. Organize those things, collaborate, coordinate together. Try to institute policies that help you recognize and provide assistance for the employees that need help. We don't want our employees to get to a point where they think violence is the only option. So think about how you can provide that assistance. How do you diffuse grievances? How do you handle those situations? Think about your physical security when it comes to an active shooter event in layers. The more barriers you can put between your employees and a bad guy, the better off you're going to be. When we started doing this research, we looked at 65 cases across the entire country. We only found one case where somebody had tried to breach a locked door. And in that particular case, they were looking for their estranged spouse. So they were looking for a very specific target. If you can lock doors, barricade doors, put multiple layers between you and a bad guy, sometimes they're very real physical layers. They're solid doors, things like that. Believe it or not, sometimes they're glass walls. And that perception of a barrier in some cases is just as good as an actual barrier. The more layers of protection you can put between you and an active shooter, the better off you're going to be. It's important that everyone understands that. Train your people what actions they can take, what's available to them. Think about run, hide, fight. A lot of people raise their hands when we talked about run, hide, fight, that's the foundation of the programs that you use. When you give those options to your employees, make sure that you're providing them the training that goes along with it. If there's an expectation that they provide first aid, make sure that they have the training that goes along with providing first aid. And communicate. It's really important to communicate. Let people know if they get out, they're able to get away from the building. How do you do accountability for your people? Because that's really important too. I talked to a law enforcement partners at a university campus yesterday that she was very concerned, the chief was very concerned about accountability. If we don't have that accountability and they don't have a method, or they haven't been trained in a method to notify their supervisors that they're okay, they're going to continue to search until they have accountability for all those people. That's a huge burden for law enforcement. I've got 4 missing people. I can't find them. I'm going to continue to go back in that building and look for those 4 people. They might be home watching Netflix. I don't know. Make sure that you've got a method for accountability. Develop a list of key contacts that can be used in any emergency situation. Right? That should be part of your overall emergency operations plan. And think about how you can partner with the media. Anybody from the media in the room today? The media can be your best friend in a situation like this because they can help you coordinate and move people out of the area. Get the messages to the media that you want shared. Stay away from the area. They can help you vet information. They can provide verified information. They're going to report on something no matter what. It's better that they're your friend, that you're making those connections now, that you know who you can call and they can help you with those messages. And lastly, it's really important to start thinking about recovery as soon as the incident occurs. Maybe not as soon as, you got your hands full right away, but as soon as possible, start thinking about recovery, right? There's a lot of things that last for a really long time in an active shooter event. The critical incident stress management component of this alone can last for years, literally. So make that part of the plan now. How do you provide those resources? What organizations are there that are out there that can provide stress management, debriefings, mental health assistance, all of those things. Talk with your insurance carriers and find out what they'll cover during an incident like this. It's really hard to get customer confidence back following an incident like this. Customer confidence, student confidence, the comfort of the parents that they're going to send their kids to a school where an incident like this happened. How do you handle that? Again, that's got to be part of that work group that you put together, that planning team. Ask those really tough questions. Make sure that you've got considerations for employees that don't return to work. Statistically speaking, 25% of your employees aren't going to come back. And that's not people that are injured or killed. That's just people that aren't comfortable coming back to work again. Right? How do you handle that? How comfortable would you be going back to work knowing that you've got 25% more work to do? That's a tough call. And again, think about how you rebrand your organization following an attack like this, because you've got to do something different. Riverside, California had a huge event that happened out there. They completely gutted a 680,000 square foot building. No square of carpet was the same after that. Changed the name of the organization. The function was still the same. It was a financial institution, but completely rebranded, a different organization. Following an event like this, you're going to be out for several days. If it's deemed a terrorist attack, you could be out for weeks with a long, ongoing FBI investigation, right? How do you account for that? How do you continue your operation? Have you made those decisions on how you can still provide services to your customers where you can't get back into your building because it's now a crime scene? Again, some of those planning considerations that you should think about now when you're putting your plan together. I threw a bunch of stuff at you. I still wanted to leave you a couple minutes for, I did good, Deanne. I gave time. But there's a couple things you can go back and you can do right now. And that's one of those things is building your team. Start thinking about who you're going to have as part of your planning team. Put those folks together now and start those conversations. Start looking at those threats that are out there. Again, there's a lot of tools that you can use to help rate those threats and prioritize those threats. Grab one of those tools, grab the team, get them together and start talking through those things. Identify what the vulnerabilities are based on those threats and your critical assets or critical nodes within your own facilities. Think about the mitigation strategies. What do you have to buy down that risk, right? Create your plan. A number of tools that are out there to create your plans. That tool that I mentioned from CISA is a great tool. It's not the end all be all. You can't just put your name at the top. There's still a lot of thought that goes into it, but it walks you through the entire planning process. And lastly, I've said it many, many times, but train on the plan. Make sure if you put something in the plan that your employees know what those things are. Train on the plan and then practice. And that's how you're going to find those gaps. Yes, ma'am.
So this is going to sound strange, but I've worried about how extensive do you train on the plan? Because I really think our biggest risk is a disgruntled team member at some point. So what level do you recommend? I mean, that you train so that someone knows what they're doing.
If you couldn't hear, the question is, at what level do you train? The concern is that if you train all of your employees on the plan, then everybody knows the plan, right? We've talked a lot about this. When I worked for the Department of Homeland Security, this was actually a big concern that we talked through a number of different organizations. And ultimately, what we came to the decision of is that it doesn't matter if the bad guy knows your plan. It doesn't matter when you're making those announcements. When we went to plain language, it doesn't matter if you say, we've got a bad guy in the building, initiate lockdown procedures. Because even if the bad guy's in the building and they know what your plan is, they can't prevent you from going through with your plan. If your plan is to run, hide, fight, well, they can't stop you from doing that. It's really important that we get the right message to our employees of where the bad guy is, so they know that running's okay from the area that they're in. Or I need to lock down because the bad guy's right outside my door, right? But frankly, it's a much better solution than not training the employees. So the decision that was made by the professionals at that point was follow through, do the training with everybody in your organization. Yep. And we're actually at that point anyway. So are there any other questions? I know we ran things a very high overview. We talked about a lot of stuff very quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions that I can answer. Plus, we've got a lot of professionals in the room that have a lot of experience that I can throw questions back at them as well. So take advantage. Yes, sir.
When you go to exercise your plan, how do you mitigate the perceived risk? So, I think you go and you practice and you actually implement, people now are worried about it. And they start overreacting or they start not wanting to come to work. How do you mitigate that perception of risk?
Understand. So the question is, how do you mitigate the risk from actually exercising the plan itself? Because a lot of times we hear back from people that we announce we're going to do an active threat exercise. It's an immediate anxiety, I guess, in the organization, right? But the message that has to be really clear that we want to provide you with some tools that you can use. It's very unlikely that an incident like this is going to happen, but we want to make sure that we're preparing you should an incident like this happen. We're going to give you an opportunity to participate in an exercise. A lot of organizations have gone to, you can voluntarily play in the exercise. If you choose not to, there will be workspace available for you to go and continue your job. But for those people that want to do the exercise, we would absolutely love to have you as part of it. Start with baby steps. Definitely, I wouldn't move into a full-scale exercise right away. That could be horrible. But if you can do a walkthrough, if you can do a tabletop exercise where you're just doing a discussion-based exercise based on what you know, what your plans are, even better. Start with those little things that you can do, reduce that anxiety, get them comfortable with what you're asking them to do and what the roles and responsibilities are, and then move to those more extensive exercises. That's going to help, I think, a lot with those, build the muscle memory, but make it a little less stressful. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
So with like larger events, we work in athletics. And so how do you educate your guests on if something like this were to happen during, God forbid, a basketball game or something along those lines where we've got 5,000 people in a very small area?
You bet. So the question is, on a larger event, when you've got a big venue, how do you educate the people that are visitors or guests in your facilities? There's a couple of things that you can do. And I go back to the training of your own employees. The guests in your venue, doesn't matter how big they are going to be looking to your employees for leadership and guidance, right? The better prepared they are to handle that responsibility, the better your guests are going to be. The other thing you can do is put up notifications of, in an incident like this, you'll be notified to evacuate the building. And these are the processes you can do. The more notices you can put about what those evacuation routes are, those types of things, where the exits are, again, the better prepared they're going to be. The biggest thing to me is that you can train the employees on, the expectation is going to be that people are going to be looking to you for guidance. The more you can build that muscle memory into those employees so that they're calm, they can address things professionally, they're not panicked themselves. That's really hard to say in an active shooter event to not panic, but the better prepared they are, the more you've built that ability in, the better they're going to be able to take care of those people around them. Yes, sir.
So kind of building off of that, I know, in terms of event venues, I know one thing my previous supervisor told me is the run, hide, fight kind of method is almost more transitioning to the, hey, follow me method? Is that something you've heard?
Yeah, and it's kind of the same process, is that, that look to the employees of, I know what I'm gonna do. Well, and you might not be able to run, but I know where the hiding places are, right? So yeah, absolutely. If you can do it safely, take those people with you, right? That's something that we train all the time in the actual run, hide, fight is, as an employee, if I can take people with me and I can do it safely, absolutely. If somebody's refusing to go, there's not much you can do with that, but yeah, you're absolutely right. AJ, I think you had something.
Yeah, on the large venue stuff, just a quick story. My wife and I went to a concert at US Bank Stadium up in Minneapolis a couple weeks ago. And before the concert started, they spent 2 or 3 minutes going through a description. People in this section, if you need to evacuate the building quickly, generally follow this procedure. And they went on about that for, like I said, 2 or 3 minutes. And my brain kind of quickly went to kind of the active threat piece to that. But they didn't say in the event of an active shooter, but most people, whether it's severe weather, whatever it might be, the threat inside the building, they gave everybody a chance to at least think about it. Better than nothing, but it was the first time I've been at a venue that large that spent 2 or 3 minutes describing sectors of the building, where you were at and where you should go.
Yeah, that's great. Anyone else? My contact information is on the slide. Like I said, we hit this really quick today. There's a lot more that goes into it. I spent 8 hours with a university yesterday, and we only just touched the surface of what we need to do there. It's the entire process takes time. To do it right takes time. Make sure that you're doing the training and education and that you're finding those gaps. You're rolling those back into your plan. It's the only way you can make your plan better. So please take down my phone number. You can get a hold of me anytime. AJ, you had one more thing?
Just if I can ask you to, I know there's people here from schools, if you can just touch on at a high level what the governor's security initiative, and so what's rolling out with that?
Yeah, you bet. So how many people are here from K through 12 schools?
Higher ed.
Higher ed. So the governor rolled out an initiative you probably saw or been paying attention to a few weeks ago, where they're offering some grants for funding opportunities to help buy down some of that risk. There are very specific categories that they're going to fund, and it's things like communications equipment, locks, camera systems, those types of things that we can actually use to help the prevention piece. They're offering, right now, the notice of financial opportunity is out. So you should have received that, or somebody in your school should have received that. It's available now online for you to submit a notice of interest in that grant opportunity. One of the things that has to go along with that, if you haven't had an assessment done at your school, it's they require that an assessment has to be completed. They can do that through 2 ways. The Department of Education in Iowa is actually taking those. If you need an assessment completed, you don't know where to go, you can contact the Department of Education. They're putting the school names on a list, and they're sending that over to the Department of Homeland Security, Iowa Department of Homeland Security, that will work with a vendor to get your school assessed. The other thing you can do if you need an assessment completed is you can look at local law enforcement. They can do the assessment for you if they have the time and the manpower to do it. If you do a third-party vendor, law enforcement can confirm the assessment's completed and the things are valid that they talk to you about. So there's a number of different ways you can complete those assessments. Those are due, I'm drawing a blank on the date, AJ. Is it 2 weeks?
2 years.
Oh, it's 2-year completion for the entire program until you receive the funding and you have your equipment in place. Right now, I think it was a 6-month initial on getting the assessment completed as part of that notice of financial opportunity. So I do have that information. Again, please take down my contact information. I can send those things to you so you have it direct from the horse's mouth and not from a really old guy's memory. Yes, sir.
Do you know how recently they would accept a threat assessment? Because we had one done in 2019.
I talked to the guy that's actually handling the program for the state, and he said up to 2 years old. So it might require a new assessment for you. Anyone else? That's all I've got for you today. I think Deanne has some closing comments, but thank you very much for listening to me. Please get a hold of me if you have any other questions. I can get you the answers if I don't have them. So thanks again.
in closing is please fill out the evaluations, and we're looking at next year to filling our lunch and learn schedule. So if there's a topic area that you feel to be helpful or informational or interesting, please put that on the evaluation. But we do read those, we do use those. So, and again, a shameless plug for next month is reunification with Heartland AEA. So that's all I have today. And you'll see our recording on our website in the next few days. So thanks for coming.